Welcome to EEPG Pathshala. I'm Professor Devarshi Prasad Nath and I teach Cultural Studies at Tejpur University. Today we are going to look at the second module of the paper, Comparative Literature and Culture, of which I am the coordinator. This module, titled Comparative Literature and Cultural Studies 2, has been jointly written by Parismita Dutta and myself. In this module, we'll be looking at the relationship between the disciplines of cultural studies and comparative literature. Further, we'll also examine the emergence of the discipline of comparative cultural studies, comparative literature to comparative cultural studies. The convergence of the disciplines of cultural studies and comparative literature, though recent, is a reality today, with many universities around the world offering degrees in such courses. In this module, we will continue to explore the relationship between the two disciplines. While in the first module, we had seen how, instead of focusing on canonical works of art, governmental history, or quantitative social data, cultural studies devotes time to subcultures, popular media, music, clothing, and sport. In this module, we'll be looking at the logic of the relationship between the two disciplines. It is essential to emphasize that cultural studies sees people not simply as consumers, but, like Miller says, as potential producers of new social values and cultural languages. In other words, cultural studies explores how the socially disadvantaged use culture to contest their position of marginalization. In the 1960s, there were many studies conducted on groups that were generally considered to be outside the precincts of normative culture. These subcultures, such as those of slaves, crowds, pirates, bandits, and the working class, represented resistance to the dominant forms of culture. In the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where the idea of the discipline germinated, cultural studies was never considered as a common or regular discipline. It made a serious attempt to bridge the gap between academics and the lived world of people. For the early practitioners of cultural studies, there is nothing like a pure academic concern that was divorced from social realities. British cultural studies was political in nature and highlighted the prospect of resistance in oppositional subcultures. However, as the discipline has come to be appropriated by universities as a regular teaching program, it has been increasingly felt that its very age has been blunted. The compromises have happened due to a number of reasons. Not last in the line of the factors responsible for these compromises has been the need. Many would argue that this is, of course, artificially generated to cater to job-oriented courses. The result has been that cultural studies has on many occasions been forced to be clubbed with other disciplines such as area studies. In the process, there has been a shift from the theoretical foundation of the discipline, a foundation that was built on the idea of a universal order and of a just society. This universal order has come to some extent to be broken down today to accommodate studies of culture. In other words, the focus has shifted from talking about universal patterns of injustice and hierarchies to looking at isolated pictures of the world. Secondly, the postmodern turn in cultural studies has challenged the traditional Marxist base of British cultural studies. The new varieties of cultural studies, which developed from the late 1970s to the present, in contrast to the earlier stages, according to Edwards, I quote, theorize a shift from the stage of state monopoly capitalism or Fordism, rooted in mass production and consumption, to a new regime of capital and the social order, sometimes described as post-Fordism or postmodernism, and characterizing a transnational and global capital that valorizes difference, multiplicity, eclecticism, populism, and intensified consumerism in a new information entertainment society, unquote. Consequently, there has been a fissure in the relationship between cultural studies and political economy. The discipline of comparative literature, for obvious reasons, has to rely on a universal paradigm. It can be argued that the discipline would have been impossible to conceive without a universal paradigm. Literature, as Matthew Arnold and Afra Lewis had argued, is a storehouse of values which are universal. The critique of totalitarianism developed by postmodernism has amounted to a destabilization of the claims of universality made by and on behalf of liberal humanism. As Katz says, I quote, postmodern theorists have pointed to the ways in which liberal humanist understanding of subjectivity have evaded its discursive and institutional construction, while feminists have pointed to the implicit masculinity of this supposed universal mode of subjectivity, unquote. One reason for growing discontent in different parts of the world today is because of the fact that being limited to the precincts of their own religious and cultural beliefs, people are discouraged to think in terms of shared values and experiences. The fact of the matter is that while the present world order encourages us to think more and more in terms of our specificities, comparative literature rests on the idea of commonality across cultures without being disrespectful to difference. Scholars of comparative literature have felt it imperative to take note of the evolving discipline of cultural studies. In fact, by the 1970s, many academicians in the West turned to literary theory, women's studies, semiotics, film and media studies, and cultural studies as the radical new choices available, abandoning comparative literature. Some other scholars expressed the view that comparative literature was in serious danger because of the challenge posed by cultural studies. This group of scholars were keen on revamping the discipline of comparative literature by drawing on insights offered by the new discipline of cultural studies. They explained that their area of academic interest can be suitably called comparative culture instead of comparative literature in its traditional sense. There are still others, however, who hold that there is a fundamental opposition between cultural studies with its popular culture orientation and comparative literature with its inclination towards canonical Eurocentric literature, which is irreconcilable. As mentioned earlier, it was conventionally believed by comparatists that art is an instrument of universal harmony and a comparatist is one who facilitates the spread of that harmony. However, gradually changes have come about in the discipline of comparative literature. In fact, it would be right to state that no discipline is ever fixed or frozen in time. Neither can we look for any singular, dramatic moments of departure from the set tradition of a discipline. In fact, on many occasions, it is seen that many different versions of a discipline coexist at a given point of time. Meanwhile, even as skepticism about the discipline of comparative literature was high in the West, the discipline began to gain new ground in the rest of the world. There were new teaching programs in comparative literature that emerged in many Asian countries. Instead of defending commonalities across cultures, as many traditional comparatists sought to do, these programs highlighted the specificity of national literatures. Swapan Majumdar says, I quote, "It is because of this predilection for national literature, much deplored by the Anglo-American critics as a methodology, that comparative literature has struck roots in the third world nations and in India in particular," unquote. These thinkers obviously do not perceive a sense of conflict between national literature and comparative literature. It is now generally agreed that comparative literature does not compare national literatures in the sense of setting one against the other. Instead, it provides a method of broadening one's perspective in the approach to single works of literature, a way of looking beyond the narrow boundaries of national frontiers in order to discern new trends and movements in various national cultures and to see the relation between literature and other spheres of human activities. In May 1993, the American Comparative Literature Association published a report on comparative literature at the turn of the century. This report is also called the Bernheimer Report 1993 after Charles Bernheimer. The report pointed to the need for practitioners of comparative literature to think in culturally pluralistic terms and also to redefine the methods of the discipline. It presented a futuristic vision for the discipline. Bernheimer and his team argued that highbrow literature should no longer be the exclusive concern of the discipline. They also believed that comparative literature should accommodate the teaching and study of literature in translation. They rightly perceived that cultural relativism in literary studies was here to stay and was bound to redefine our understanding of comparative literature. When we read Bernheimer saying, I quote, "Attention should also be paid to the role of non-canonical readings of canonical text, readings from various contestatory, marginal or subaltern perspectives," unquote, we perceive the distinct impact of cultural studies. This cultural turn in comparative literature implores us to take into account the ideological, cultural and institutional context of literature. There was thus a shift of focus from the aesthetics of art to the process of production of meaning. Background of comparative cultural studies. Comparative cultural studies has evolved gradually through history, setting it apart from comparative literature. Susan Bassnett, while describing the present status of comparative literature, states that comparative literature in one sense is dead today. Comparative literature is presently being associated with different perspectives like sociology of knowledge, the current situation and history of literary studies, and the general status and situation of the humanities. In making her claim about the current status of the discipline of comparative literature, Bassnett was probably considering the fact that traditional centers of comparative literature are today being taken over by English and cultural studies departments around the world. But it is a fact that although its scope and influence has dwindled into traditional centers in the last 2 decades, the discipline of comparative literature is emerging with renewed vigor and strength in the countries and cultures where it was practically non-existent earlier. This is evident from the emergence of new chairs and journals in comparative literature in different countries of Asia, Latin America and Africa. These developments of comparative literature have brought some fresh perspectives into the discipline. At the same time, the traditional centers for comparative literature have also produced some exciting new works in the discipline. In this context, one of the most significant volumes of recent years is John Kirby's The Comparative Reader, a hand list of basic reading in comparative literature. According to D. Zapetnek, this work has enlightened bibliographies of national literatures, literary and critical theory, various methodologies such as psychological, semiotic, etc., approaches, media and literature, including film, postcolonial literatures, and the professional and institutional aspects of the discipline of comparative literature. Stephen Tortesi D. Zapetnak proposed a framework for comparative cultural studies for the first time. Various interdisciplinary perspectives have been incorporated into this approach, but the point that needs to be noted here is that, as Zapetnak points out, many of these perspectives are not new for researchers engaged with comparative literature. The newness of the comparative cultural studies approach lies in the fact that these perspectives are now explicitly formulated and adapted to its new paradigm, which is informed by the tenets of cultural studies. In the countries where comparative literature is experiencing an emerging interest, the impact of cultural studies is clearly discernible. In Zapetnak's view, I quote, It is this situation that I think we can capitalize on. What I mean is that the interest and new work in comparative literature occurring outside the traditional centers of the discipline can be related and connected to the impact of cultural studies on the one hand, and taking the history and intellectual achievements of comparative literature, in particular its aspect of cross-culturality based upon in-depth knowledge and familiarity with other languages and cultures, toward the construction of a framework and practice of comparative cultural studies. On the other hand, unquote. The comparative aspect in cultural studies is a relatively unexplored area in academics. D. Zapitnak provides a list of universities which have introduced degree programs in a combination of comparative literature and cultural studies, or an outright program in comparative cultural studies. He mentions the graduate program in comparative cultural studies at Sophia University, Tokyo, the program of cultural studies and comparative literature at the University of Minnesota, the Center for British and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Warwick, the Center for Comparative Literature and Cultural Studies at Monash University, the Comparative Cultural Studies program at Trinity College of Vermont, the Center for Comparative Cultural Studies at the Palacky University in the Czech Republic, the Comparative Literary and Cultural Studies program at the University of Connecticut, or the University of Virginia program in Comparative Cultural Studies. But in these institutions, there is a lack of proper theoretical and methodological framework. Without these, comparative cultural studies can be, as of now, better defined as an approach rather than a discipline, according to D. Zapitnak. From comparative literature today towards comparative cultural studies. Defining comparative literature is not an easy task, because the act of defining itself is perceived as limiting, demarcating, and ultimately opposed to the openness evidently characteristic of the very field itself. Some scholars are even opposed to the use of the term comparative literature. For instance, Albert Guerard rejected the term in 1958. In Guerard's opinion, I quote, "My attachment to the principle of comparative literature gives me the right to express my opinion that the term comparative literature is useless, dangerous, and ought to be abolished," unquote. His opposition to the term raised on the implication of the term as referring to the foreign relations of national literatures. Instead of the term comparative literature, Lillian first suggested the name comparative study of literature based on the grammatical understanding of the term. Michael Palencia-Roth preferred contrastive literature. It can be argued that the use of the term comparative may indicate the loss of uniqueness of different literatures of the world and is going against the principle of looking at literature through the culture-specific context. However, it is because of the institutional status of the term comparative literature that we continue to use it. Nevertheless, the kinds of arguments forwarded by thinkers like Lillian First and Michael Palencia-Roth have necessitated the need to look beyond the confines of a narrowly conceived approach to comparative literature. Cultural studies is one of the cross-currents which can stand against the Eurocentric bias of the discipline of comparative literature. The traditional scope of comparative literature within canonical literary texts can be widened with insights drawn from cultural studies. So today, comparative literature is proceeding towards comparative cultural studies. Zapitnak is of the view that comparative literature can, in turn, greatly contribute to cultural studies. He proposed a broad framework for comparative cultural studies with three areas of theoretical content. Number one, to study literature, the text and or the literary system with and in the context of culture and the discipline of cultural studies. Number two, in cultural studies itself, to study literature from borrowed elements, theories and methods from comparative literature. And number three, to study culture and its composite parts and aspects in the mode of the proposed comparative cultural studies approach. His aim is to establish comparative cultural studies as a framework which can help to subvert this established hierarchy of cultural products and production which focus exclusively on literature. The complete history of comparative literature in all its manifest forms is yet to be written. The available supplementary types of material on comparative literature would help its stimulated international history, but at the same time, there is a need for an institutional history of comparative literature in a national and international context. Jepetnak is dedicated to the idea of such a kind of history. According to him, instead of presenting histories of comparative literature in the usual process, a more useful model or approach would be to discuss the histories of comparative literature based on a regional approach. Thus, he proposes to present this new approach by interpreting the region as a culture-specific environment. Citing the inaugural lecture on what is comparative literature of George Steiner as Lord Weidenfeld Professor of European Comparative Literature at Oxford University in 1994, Jepetnak discusses that in traditional comparative literature, the knowledge of foreign languages is considered as essential for the scholar. At the same time, the matter of translation and thematic studies also got privilege. But for Jepetnak, the knowledge of foreign language need not be necessarily privileged, as comparative literature is today growing with an inclusionary ideology which should be guided by a precise methodology. He gave greater emphasis to the use and mention of a proper and clear method in comparative literature. Generally, most of the scholars of comparative literature do not give much importance to methods and methodology, as they consider comparative literature to be the translation of literature and culture, and cross-cultural inclusionary ideology and practice to be its methodology. So, in the history of comparative literature and proposed framework of comparative cultural studies by Jepetnak, methodology is a major concern. In his essay, From Comparative Literature Today Towards Comparative Cultural Studies, Jepetnak mentions that Hugo Dizering covers two areas of comparative literature. One of this is the comparative history of literature, where similarities and differences between two individual literatures are involved. The other is a comparative theory and methodology of literature, dealing with literary theories developed in individual countries or linguistic areas, and with corresponding methods of literary criticism. Jepetnak had accepted the second area of Dizering's argument, but he also advocated the use of an applied method of comparative literature. The relationship between comparative literature and comparative cultural studies. In the mid-1990s, Susan Basnett's Comparative Literature, A Critical Introduction, and the Bernheimer Report of the ACLA, or the American Comparative Literature Association, highlighted many current aspects of comparative literature. They won recognition for pointing out the dissolution of comparative literature into translation studies on the one hand and cultural studies on the other. The Bernheimer Report was one of the first provocative reactions to the discipline of cultural studies. It has suggested a list of the actual things taken for comparison today, which includes the artistic productions, cultural constructions of different disciplines, Western and non-Western cultural traditions, both high and popular, gender constructions, and racial and ethnic modes of signifying. The basic informational setting of the text was obvious on the lexical level, since in comparison with the previous two reports of the American Comparative Literature Association, the prevalent term was in fact not literature but culture. According to the author's opinion in the report, the comparing should also, if not above all, entail the comparing of different cultures. Similarly, throughout her book, The Death of a Discipline, Gayatri Spivak also talks about a new comparative literature. She states that liberal multiculturalism is the agenda of comparative literature, and this has given a boost to cultural studies. While discussing the relationship between cultural studies and comparative literature, many critics consider cultural studies to be a subset of comparative literature. But Elaine Martin argues otherwise. I quote, "By viewing comparative literature as a subcategory of cultural studies, that is, by viewing literature as a subcategory of cultural production or its artifacts, as a whole, we end up with a workable formula. All comparative literature is cultural studies, but not all cultural studies are comparative literature." Unquote. This implies the need of exclusive association with the literary text, as in the scholarship of comparative literature might not be felt necessary at all times in the new form of comparative literature informed by cultural studies. On the other hand, the literary text in comparative literary studies is not deemed to be sufficient in itself, because along with translation, analysis in the original language and cultural competence are necessary in order to comprehend the essence of a text. In fact, comparative cultural studies can enhance the scope of comparative literature. In the traditional mode of comparative literature, the areas of specialization were confined to the country studied, period, genre, and problems, themes, or approaches, with the traditional high canon as main focus. In such approaches, the concept of great literature was privileged. Therefore, Catherine Arendt has rightly said, I quote, "The elite culture assumptions behind such practices, such as judgments about purportedly value-neutral abstracts like beauty, have long been revealed as exclusionary. In consequence, today's literary and cultural studies set new goals for their interpretive practices. Analysis of cultural processes, especially those relating to identity formation, inclusion, marginalization, and exclusion. In consequence, new canonical canons purportedly worthy of study have also emerged, especially including texts that have to respond to specific cultural context, not just to the aesthetic and social codes of high culture." With the beginning of cultural studies, scholars started to engage with the basic questions relating to which texts serve which party's objectives and at what particular cost or benefit to the cultures in which they appear. Analysis of the aesthetic value of text or the structure of text cannot provide satisfactory answers to these questions, as plots and themes of text correlate to historical and cultural debate. The answers to these questions are found in the analysis of plots and themes. Comparison of text in this regard across national lines can represent social and political marginalization of different times. Thus, while comparative cultural studies differs from comparative literature, the latter has enlarged its scope thanks to the former. Comparative literature, comparative cultural studies, and the humanities. Comparative literature as a discipline has often encountered questions on its identity and status. Literary studies represents an essential part of being human, so that its study and interpretation makes the humanities valuable in themselves. Comparative literature is an interdisciplinary subject with a large spectrum of cultural perspectives, from gender studies to translation studies and from communication studies to environmental studies are included. In this way, it is more closely aligned to the discipline of cultural studies. The core idea of cultural studies lies in the relationship between culture and power, as we have discussed in the last module. Though cultural studies as a research-based discipline is broad, it focuses on too many issues at the same time. The result is that an enormous body of amorphous work gets labeled as cultural studies. The approach of comparative cultural studies grants focus to the discipline of cultural studies. Comparative cultural studies is relevant for understanding literature's contextual aspects with reference to the question on cultural practices and power, everyday life, the socio-political, economic, and any other relevant context. The approach of comparative cultural studies grants focus to the discipline of cultural studies. Comparative cultural studies is relevant for understanding literature's contextual aspects with reference to the question on cultural practices and power, everyday life, the socio-political, economic, and any other relevant context. Conclusion. The cross-cultural, interdisciplinary, and transnational literary analysis of comparative literature as today move towards a comparative cultural studies. The growing interest in culturally oriented studies compels us to adopt the approach of comparative cultural studies. Comparative cultural studies aims to study culture in a global and intercultural context. This new approach of comparative literature helps to overcome the high and low, canonical and popular binaries. During the last 10 to 15 years, the discipline of comparative literature has evolved into comparative cultural studies through the appropriation of the theories and principles of cultural studies and English studies. As part of this new approach, Stephen Dorsey D. Zapotnak has forwarded 3 theoretical frameworks. Through these areas, scope of comparative literature can be widened, and at the same time, it is also expected that the common criticism of Eurocentric bias leveled against comparative literature can be overcome. Literature can be regarded as a subcategory of cultural production or its artifacts as a whole. Considering the relationship between comparative literature and comparative cultural studies, we believe that comparative cultural studies can be viewed as a subcategory of cultural studies. From this, it emerges that all comparative literature is cultural studies, but not all cultural studies is comparative literature. This implies that the need of association of literary text in the scholarship of comparative literature might not be felt necessary for all times in the scholarship of cultural studies. But in such case, the question arises as to how it can be a new approach of comparative literature without considering a literary text. The answer might be found in the application of borrowed elements like methods and theories from comparative literature in the form of contextual approach of the discipline of cultural studies. We can look at Indian literature from the perspective of this new approach. In a country as plural and diverse as India, the importance of comparative literature is immense. The approach of comparative cultural studies would provide better purpose than the traditional critical analytical method. Indian literature is often described as one but written in different languages because of its common civilizational heritage and influence. But comparative cultural studies would help us to problematize this understanding of Indian literature and also to pay sufficient attention to the regional varieties of Indian literature. Comparison of text from the vantage point of this new approach can represent the social and political marginalization of different times and in the context of different national strains. Cultural studies has generally stayed away from an aesthetic evaluation of art and literature. So the scope of judging text as good or bad, high or low, is practically non-existent in cultural studies. It is possible to argue that comparative cultural studies threatens to undo the status of cultural studies as a discipline that aspires to stay away from any form of value judgment. But then, in this new approach of comparative agenda, the intention is not to judge the quality or aesthetic merit of literary text or any cultural production. So, comparative cultural studies sets new goals for analysis of cultural processes, especially those relating to identity formation, marginalization, inclusion, and exclusion. As a result, the formation of new textual canons becomes possible, including texts that respond to diverse cultural contexts in diverse ways, not just to the limited aesthetic and social codes of high culture. With this, we come to the end of this module on comparative literature and cultural studies 2. Thank you.